Hi everyone, this is Ravi Agrawal, your host for today. We're going to get started in 1 minute, just as we wait to get settled down. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Managing Editor at Foreign Policy, and I'm happy to be your host for the next half hour. I hope you're all well and staying safe. These are strange times, and as many of you know, today was supposed to be an in-person convening, but given the dangers of the pandemic, we're hosting our first FP virtual dialogue. If there's a bright side, we're able to welcome many more of you on this call than we could in person. So really a big thank you for being part of it. And as I'm speaking, I can see hundreds of you joining in. The last time many of us came together was last fall at FP's Her Power Summit, where FP Analytics launched the Her Power Index, which looked at the degree of women's underrepresentation across US foreign policy agencies and ways to address it. Today, we're launching FPA's most recent research. It's called Women as Levers of Change, and it is much broader in scope and showcasing some of the key and positive findings. Hopefully, that will be a welcome break from other news of the day. Our guest today, I have Aditi Mohapatra. She is the Managing Director of BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, a trailblazer with respect to gender diversity and inclusion, and she undoubtedly is a change maker in her own right. We also have FP's very own Alison Carlson. She's Managing Director of FP Analytics, the Research and Advisory Division of Foreign Policy, which produced the study Women as Levers of Change. And of course, I am Ravi Agrawal. Before we get started, for those of you just joining in, some housekeeping notes. For those of you logged in via a Zoom app, at the bottom of the Zoom video viewer, you will find three buttons: audio settings, Q&A, and raise hand. We would love to hear from you. Click the Q&A button and a window will appear where you can submit your questions at any point during this call. We will address as many of them as possible live. And if we can't get to all of them, I know that Alison and Aditi will be happy to try and respond offline afterwards. If you're not on Zoom and you're calling in, you can submit your questions to events@foreignpolicy.com as they arise. We also encourage all of you to join the conversation online by using hashtag Women as Levers of Change and tweeting at Foreign Policy PR. The full report, of course, is up at womenasleversofchange.com. Okay, let's get started. Again, if you're just joining us, I'm Ravi Agrawal, joined by Alison Carlson and Aditi Mohapatra, and we're going to start with a quick look at what's inside the new Women as Levers of Change report. Alison, let's start with you. Let's dig into the report for a minute. How did this research project come about? Take it away.
Thanks, Ravi, and thanks again to all of you for joining us. Ravi, as you know, our division does a lot of work looking at policy and economic trends that are affecting businesses and the global economy. And as we all know, businesses and industries around the world are really coming under increasing pressure to transform and to transition toward more sustainable and socially responsible products and practices. And what we're seeing is that failure to do so could compromise their competitiveness, and in some cases, even render them obsolete. And we're seeing this pressure coming from different areas and different sectors. And one big group is through consumers, and consumers are demanding healthier, more environmentally friendly and safer products. We're also seeing more pressure coming from the investment community, where sustainable investment is moving beyond just a niche industry, but we're actually seeing it also move to pension funds and major investors, investment banks, where they're increasingly integrating environmental, social, and governance factors, or ESG factors, into their investment decisions. But we're also actually seeing it in the workplace as well, where workers, particularly younger workers, millennials and others, are choosing not to work for companies that don't align with their values. And so when looking at these pressures and considering these different factors, we really wanted to dig into the industries and find out what was going on. And the legacy industries that we looked at for this study, they have historically made up the large shares of economies worldwide. And they're predominantly male dominated. And these industries are really under exceptional pressure to transform. And so we wanted to dig in and learn what they're doing, how they're transforming, and how others can learn from their example.
Sure. So you speak of exceptional pressure, but how do you see this pressure relating specifically to gender?
Well, when thinking about different pathways that these industries could improve performance, we realized that gender diversity is all too often overlooked as a means to facilitate that change and as a strategy, frankly, for making that change. And, women represent about half the global labor force and even half of new graduates in higher education. But when we're looking at the data, they only represent about a third of those employed in these industries. And so we wanted to dig in further and understand how increasing representation, and if increasing representation, could really boost innovation and facilitate change across the board.
Well, fortunately, Alison, there's been an increasing level of interest in gender-related work. What makes your research different?
There's been, in the last several years in particular, a lot of really tremendous work that's been going on in this space from researchers, academic institutions, the private sector, and others. But in thinking about it and digging down, we realized that there was still a major gap in the research about how women are transforming. And so in addition to our quantitative analysis, we really wanted to reach out to women that are working in the field, that are on the ground in this space, to understand what they're experiencing, the changes that they're making, and how they can scale those practices and how various stakeholders can scale those practices to make broader based change.
Thanks, Alison. So tell us what the analysis actually revealed. What are the key details that you were able to find out?
Well, as I was mentioning, we were looking across a range of industries. It included 14 industries across a broad scope of sectors. And I just really like to give a quick shout out to the research team here, particularly Yushin Lin and Isabel Schmidt and Anna Broad. They really, really did a tremendous level of work on this, so wanted to give them credit for these findings. But in digging down deeper, what we found is that there's really a tremendous degree of underrepresentation across the board and throughout the pipeline. What we found is that in employment, women represent on average just 21% of employees across these industries. And the numbers actually get even worse when we look at the makeup of leadership and boards, with women representing just 18% of management and 13% of board members.
Wow.
Right, so there still is significant underrepresentation across these industries. But what's really fascinating about that is digging down into the numbers and the data. And we were looking at 2,300 companies worldwide. What we found is that even with this underrepresentation, women are having material impacts and transforming these industries in different ways. And what we found is that these industries are, on average, those that have the highest percentage of women in executive management and on boards are on average 40%, 47% more profitable, 32% more transparent, and have on average 74% higher ESG ratings. And this really matters. And this is with underrepresentation. And to think about the impact that women could have at scale is really quite incredible.
Alison, I just want to ask you, the higher sort of Alison, I just want to ask you, the higher profitability that you're describing, that is a strong correlation, right? It's not a causality, but it's a strong correlation, right?
It is. And we can't prove causality as there are a number of factors that are contributing to profitability and competitiveness. But what we did find is that there is statistical significance with increasing gender representation and profitability and competitiveness.
Got it. And one would hope that knowing these kinds of things and having this data would encourage the corporate world to think more about the importance of diversity in their workforce. But I do want to ask you before we bring in Aditi as well, is that if women are having these material impacts, why are they still so substantially underrepresented?
Yeah, as I mentioned, they're having tremendous impact already, but there still exist a number of barriers to increasing representation throughout the pipeline. And we have some of them listed here, as everyone can see on the call and on the Zoom, is they're in a number of categories. And this is showing up in different ways. It's showing up in discriminatory hiring practices, gender-based discrimination, workplace harassment, and limited upward mobility, among other hurdles. But what we found in digging down into the research, and in particular in the conversations that we had with women throughout the course of this study, and thanks again to all of those women, many of whom are on this call, for participating, that these barriers aren't insurmountable, but we need to address them and learn what's working and what's working well to really pinpoint and focus on the solutions.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. And where can we find this report?
It's available now for download on our microsite. So I'd like to direct everyone's attention to womenasleversofchange.com, where the report can be found. And the microsite is an opportunity to engage with the research. And it's an interactive site where we have our key findings, as well as highlights from our interviews, individual case stories, and also detailed solutions with explicit recommendations of what both companies can do, as well as other stakeholders to really facilitate change.
Great, thanks a lot, Alison. I want to bring in Aditi Mohapatra. She's again the Managing Director at BSR. And for those of you who are just joining us, and I can see more than 500 of you have joined us in the last few minutes, this is FP's first virtual conference call where we're discussing FPA's Women as Levers of Change report. I'm Ravi Agrawal, and I'm very happy to convene an all-star panel, Aditi Mohapatra and Alison. Let me bring in Aditi now. Clearly, given all of the things that Alison has just shown us from this excellent report, so much more work needs to be done. And given your work leading BSR's women's empowerment initiatives globally and across industries, what are you experiencing on the ground? What's changing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ravi, for that. And thank you, Ravi and Allison, for having me for today's discussion. Really great research from FP, and we really appreciate having this research out there. You know, I think from our perspective, the business case has been made quite clear. So it's very important to obviously start there and really make that compelling point that this is not just about the kind of moral case of what's right to do, but that there are clear business benefits of investing and advancing women. And now it's really about what are the specific steps that companies need to be taking. I think more and more where we see effective and real leadership is when companies commit from the top to taking action. So we really think it's really critical to make sure, of course, that from the CEO level that this kind of commitment is made and that there's accountability structures built in throughout the company to really make sure that the company is addressing these disparities.
So what are some of the actions that BSR would recommend to businesses, and specifically those legacy industries? What steps can they take to meaningfully improve gender diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think there's several there's a whole list of things if companies really want to get involved. But I think first and foremost, of course, is actually making your own internal business case for why these issues are important for you as a business. So looking at your customer base, your investors, your stakeholders, and really understanding why gender equality drives business performance for you as a company, I think is a really important place to start. The second place we regularly advise companies is to take a look at your own data. This is very often a very kind of emotional conversation for business leaders. Everybody wants to feel like you're doing good when it comes to this topic, but I think starting with data really helps to kind of neutralize the conversation and really just make it kind of a fact-based conversation. This is where we are today. This is where we want to get over the next 2, 5, and 10 years, and starting to put in place some of those target metrics and goals.
Aditi, that it seems to me there are almost two ends to this problem, because on the one hand, you have the pipeline problem with entry-level positions and how, I imagine a certain set of recommendations would work for those positions, but then you have a different set of issues with leadership positions or to bring women on boards at these companies, right?
Absolutely, yes. Both really need to be addressed. I think for too long I think many industries have kind of cited the pipeline problem and said, well, it's a little bit out of our hands because this is really just about a lack of women in this field, and we don't really have anything that we can do about that. Um, but I think increasingly you are seeing examples of companies that are really investing in building out those pipelines and trying to make their industries more attractive to a diverse set of entrants. And at the same time, as you mentioned, it's really critical to focus on making sure that the women that are in your company are being retained and are being advanced. That type of role modeling that
Mhm.
demonstrates that those industries provide opportunities for women to be leaders is really, really critical as well.
Can you give us, Aditi, an example or two of concrete steps that companies have taken that, in your opinion, seem to be working?
Yeah, sure. So I think, particularly for male-dominated industries, we've seen companies definitely invest in apprenticeship programs where you are starting to bring in women into roles where they previously had not been involved in. I think those are really critical, particularly as the skills needed for a variety of sectors are evolving. Just given automation and new technologies and how industries are transforming altogether. So those types of programs are really important. We've also seen programs around mentorship as being very critical in moving the needle. So mentorship and sponsorship, particularly where you have male leaders engaging with female colleagues throughout the company as mentors and sponsors. One, because those women are then getting access to the networks that are really important to move into leadership positions, but also it's building greater awareness on the part of male leaders within companies about the lived experiences of women within those companies. And so it's transforming both that individual woman's experience in the job, and it's also really transforming that male leaders'
Mhm.
understanding of their experience. So we've seen engaging men as allies in this kind of space as being really, really critical as well.
That really resonates with Didi. I can understand why this isn't just a fight for one side, I think, and engaging men would be very important. We're beginning to get some questions from our listeners in today. And for those of you who haven't been able to submit questions yet, it's very easy. Click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your video screen, type in your question. They're beginning to come in, and we will pose them to Aditi and to Alison. You can also tweet online, hashtag women as leaders of change. You can tweet at foreign policy PR. And the report, if you want to look at it as we're discussing it, is at womenasleadersofchange.com. I want to put to both of you a question that just came in from one of our listeners. And it goes like this: what are important domestic policy actions that governments can implement to strategically increase representation in these male-dominated industries? I'll put that to you first, Aditi, but I'd also like to hear Alison on this.
Sure. I think given some of the barriers that we had just saw from the research, in particular, efforts around paid leave are very important. We see all too often that is one of the biggest barriers to women's ability to stay and be retained in the workplace. And so initiatives where both men and women are encouraged to take leave as part of shared parental responsibilities are really, really important. And so investing in paternity leave as well as maternity leave are critical. And then, of course, showcasing that. So not just having those kinds of policies on paper, but then individual company leaders also setting the example by taking those kinds of leave and encouraging their colleagues to do the same is important as well.
Right. Alison?
Absolutely. And I would just echo what Aditi said as well. I mean, I think there's a really important role for both governments and international institutions to craft and pass and really enforce laws and regulations that are supporting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And in addition to those that Aditi mentioned, additional ones could be mandating information disclosure and really supporting pathways to collect accurate and timely data. I really appreciate what Aditi said about data. We're a really data-driven division. And if we don't know and don't have the data that's available and that's sex disaggregated, it's going to be really difficult to identify where the gaps really exist and to pinpoint solutions and to really increase female labor participation across the board.
So let me push you both on that because, I think data certainly resonates, and to see, I think for business leaders to see that there's a strong correlation between hiring more women and seeing increases in profitability and in other areas. What are some other metrics that FPA and other groups like that should start tracking, Aditi?
Sure. I mean, so I do think that companies are looking at internally a number of different data sets, things like obviously the representation of women in lots of different critical roles. They're also looking at data sets around equal pay and the kind of quality of work. So not just the representation, but the quality of work. And when you look at data sets around equal pay, it's important to look at, of course, whether or not men and women are being paid equally for the same types of positions, but also another level that you can look at is overall, on average, how are women being paid within your company versus how are men being paid? What that helps you to realize is what are the kinds of roles that women are in versus the types of roles that men are in. And the solutions to both will obviously look a little bit different, but it really helps illuminate, whether or not you're kind of, yes, you have some female representation, but are they in the high income, high earning roles, which will make that industry over time more attractive to a diverse set of talent. So that's one area. The other I would say is, you may have the right kinds of benefits in place, things like parental leave or other aspects like that, but are you really tracking the rate at which both men and women are taking advantage of those kinds of programs? Are you tracking the rate at which men and women are taking advantage of different professional development and training programs as well? So just looking at these kinds of programs or benefits that you think you might have in place with gender disaggregated data is really helpful to being able to understand whether or not those programs are actually effective.
Sure. I have one more question from a listener. I don't know if this is from a man or a woman, but here goes. How can men be good allies and supports to their colleagues and the women reporting to them in the workplace? Aditi, I'm going to put that to you.
Sure. So, I think one, they can role model good behavior. They can make sure that they're creating a culture and environment. Very often, where we are today, and we saw based on the data, is that men are in positions of leadership throughout corporate America, and they are the ones that are setting the tone for what corporate cultures look like and what behavior is acceptable and what's not. So I think first and foremost, it is about setting up a kind of culture that you would want to be part of and you would want your company to be representative of. I think that's one. I think the other is to really have kind of an open mind to where things are today and to have a sense of to be inclined to really be aware of what the situation is within your company and to have a sense of empathy around that as well. We think it's, just important that men are part of the conversation and don't view this as just a quote unquote kind of woman's problem, but are really thinking about it as, a driver for business success for the overall company as well.
Right. I have one more question from a listener, and this is sort of a two-parter. So I'm going to put one part to Alison, one part to Aditi. And the question is, you've both come up with really smart ideas and sort of tangible policies that companies can put in place to improve gender outcomes in the workplace. But on the one hand, how do you ensure that these same practices are practiced along their supply chains? That's one. And two, how do you ensure that they are practiced across different cultures and geographies? Because as we all know, so many of these attitudes towards gender inequality differ from place to place. So Alison, I'm going to put the question about supply chains to you. If you can go first, and then Aditi, I'll come to you about geography.
Sure. I think this question, it's a great one, and it really underscores the importance of leadership and clarity at the top in terms of setting the tone, as Aditi mentioned, and establishing policies that are clear, that apply to headquarters, but that also apply throughout the supply chain. And so establishing that clarity and leadership at the top will then funnel down. But in order for it to do so, it's important that those policies then are implemented throughout and that they're tracked throughout. And so having that tracking mechanism and having clear metrics for that tracking is really important. And also to communicate with vendors, supply chain companies, et cetera, that they are also going to be responsible and accountable for those metrics as well.
That's good advice. Aditi, let me then put the other part of that question to you. It's one thing to push for these advances, say in Western Europe. It's quite another thing in, say, South Asia. So how would you account for that? What kinds of steps have you seen companies already put in place, companies that are global, and what works best?
Yeah, sure. So it's again a very important question, and it is very, very important to take all of these kinds of recommendations with the lens of cultural awareness and sensitivity. And so, I do think that the starting point should be that equality is something that we are all seeking to achieve kind of globally, and that the way that we might get there may look a little different in different cultures. But however, that is a common objective, and that is again set from the tone at the top. I think it is really important, though, to leverage and work with your teams regionally. Each of these different communities has a whole host of different social norms and cultural stereotypes and biases that are informing the situation that may come into the workplace. So as a female or a male colleague comes into a workplace, they're coming with a whole range of different cultural biases and stereotypes that need to be addressed. And to really do that, it really does mean partnering with your different offices around the world to create content that is most meaningful for them, and really addressing the issues that are most relevant and of the moment for them as well. So data can be helpful in that respect as well, again, because it does take some of that kind of cultural context out of the way. But really partnering with local organizations in those different regions who understand some of those nuances and who have helped build programs to address some of those can be really important.
Great. I have to say, we have been overwhelmed with questions from our listeners in, so thank you very much for that. I'm trying to scroll through a list of 50 plus questions right now, and we don't have too much more time, but what I will say is that I know Alison will be very keen to get back to you offline after this conference is over. But Alison, I have a very quick question for you, and that's a more technical one. Over what time period was the data in your report collected? And how do you see it changing over the next 5 years?
Great. Thank you for that. So the data that fed into the quantitative analysis was from 2013 to 2018. And it's worldwide data, as I mentioned. So this wasn't just looking at the US. But what we're hoping to see in the next 5-10 years is that data get more robust, more detailed, more sex disaggregated, so that we can have even more granular insight into what's actually happening in these companies and across the industries.
Great. Aditi, I've gotten a lot of questions from our listeners in today on asking you to expand more on what constitutes an effective mentorship program. And related to that, what kinds of steps should be taken if an employee is in a situation where executives and managers at the company do not see the underrepresentation of women as an issue?
Hmm. Yeah, so this is so I mean on mentorship, I think, one of the keys that I did mention is thinking about kind of non-traditional partners, and so definitely connecting different parts of the business together as a way of expanding networks, which is really important, and making sure that you have your senior male executives involved and as champions of the program, sharing their experiences, sharing what they learned as mentors as well, and not just for the mentees' benefit, but also the mentors' benefit is really critical. Um, the second part of your question, can you just remind me what that was?
Sure. It was a rather specific one of what steps could be taken if an employee is in a situation where managers
Yeah.
at the company don't even see underrepresentation of women as an issue.
Yeah. I think you can look to some of your broader commitments. So, have you made commitments as a company to diversity and inclusion? Have you made commitments to human rights? Have you committed to the sustainable development goals? What are the different entry points that already are informing your company's broader sustainability or corporate responsibility agenda, where gender equality is a key component of that? I think that's one. I think pulling on and leveraging some of this business case data to make sure that they understand the value that they're leaving on the table by not paying attention to these issues is another critical one. And then sharing the data where you can around the makeup of your workforce, maybe bringing in some peer company examples of how others are paying attention to this issue and how it's really putting you at a competitive loss to not be paying attention.
Hmm. We are almost out of time, but I just want to get to one more question that came in, and that is about technology. What impact will new technologies have in all of these male-dominated industries that we were discussing? Is it going to open up more opportunities for women, or will men just be retrained to take new jobs, Aditi?
Yeah, this is something that BSR has done a fair amount of research into as well. And I think, the truth is no one knows. There's both opportunity and there's both potentially a huge loss for women in this new kind of new world of work. And so on the opportunity side, we're recommending that companies be really intentional about the kinds of reskilling and upskilling programs that they're developing, thinking with a gender lens in mind to some of those. We do see with some male dominated industries, particularly those in construction and in other places where physical labor was a key component of success, as those move to more technology based systems, there might be additional entry points for women in some of those roles. And we also know that some of the skills that women will bring, that women currently bring and will bring to future workplaces around human and social skills, which will be critical to work alongside some of the kind of machine and robotics introductions, will be really valuable for companies. So I think, on the whole, it's very unclear, but what we do know is that companies need to be really intentional as they're transforming their workplaces and thinking with a gender lens as part of their solutions.
Great. Thank you, Aditi. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to wrap there. This has been amazing just to see how many hundreds of people, I think 600 plus attendees, which really is something we couldn't have done in person. So in that sense, it's really great to see all of you on FP's first ever virtual dialogue. You've been listening to a discussion about women as levers of change. Do take a look at the report online at womenasleversofchange.com. I know many of you have sent in questions that we weren't able to get to, but if I know one thing about Alison, she's incredibly conscientious and will get back to you and even try and engage you in a dialogue afterwards. So I want to say thank you very much to our excellent guests, Aditi Mohapatra of BSR Alison Carlson of FP Analytics, of course. Thanks to all of you for being part of FP's first virtual dialogue. I'm going to give the last word to Alison.
Thanks, Ravi, and thanks, Aditi. And thanks again to all of you for joining us and for being part of what is now our virtual community. We're really excited to share this work and wanting you to engage with it, go to the microsite, download the report, and share it with your colleagues, with your family, with your friends. And as Ravi was saying, we'd love to hear your feedback, so please share that with us. And we just wanted to let you know that this is part of a dialogue that we're beginning and that we're going to expand. This is our first virtual dialogue, but this is a prelude for an in-person event that we'll be holding as soon as it's safe to do so. So I'd just like to encourage you all to remain engaged and stay tuned, and we'll be sending out notifications of that event in DC as soon as that's scheduled. We already have a dynamic group of experts that are lined up, and we'll be gathering to provide more important discussions and opportunities to network with one another. And we hope to see many of you there. But in the meantime, thank you again for coming today, and stay safe.
And don't touch your face. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.